States around the country are now embracing voting rights after nearly 2 years of passing restrictive laws. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, 45 states have introduced 204 bills to expand voting rights just this year. So far, 7 states have passed these bills. They include online voter registration, easing photo ID restrictions, and expanding early voting. And just yesterday, Virginia's Republican Governor Bob McDonnell surprisingly announced plans to make it easier to restore voting rights to felons. That's not to say conservatives aren't putting up a fight. While there is an increase in expanded voting rights, 31 states introduced 82 bills restricting voting access. In Arkansas, lawmakers overrode a gubernatorial veto requiring photo IDs to vote. Nebraska shortened its early voting period, and Montana is trying to repeal Election Day registration. What does this all mean for the next election? Well, joining us today from Washington, D.C. is Deputy Director of the Brennan Center for Justice, Myrna Pérez. She heads up the center's voting rights team. Myrna, welcome to the War Room.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know, in the past couple of years, we've seen a wave of restrictive voting laws, but now it seems like a new era where voting rights are expanding. Can you tell us what trend you're seeing there?
We would agree that there are states increasing their opportunities to make voting freer and fairer and more accessible for its citizens. But I do want to remind the viewers that it is not a new era. It is, in fact, a very American tradition of having a trajectory that is more expansive. We have taken a number of steps in this country to make sure that women and minorities and students can vote and participate in this system. And actually what we saw in the run up until the 2012 elections was a throwback to a much more shameful part of our history where we were trying to restrict the rights.
That's really true. I mean, it's not a new era at all. It's an aberration. And I think it's like we set the refresh button a little bit more than we've moved to a new era. The era since the Voting Rights Act has been to increase access to the ballot box, and then we sort of took a step backwards. What were some of the problems that voters faced in the November elections last year? Did that create momentum for these new trends we're seeing?
I think a number of things created momentum. Right before the 2012 election, voters, voting rights advocates, the courts, the Department of Justice all fought back against the wave of restrictive legislations, and we were winning. And I think that created some momentum, as well as some of the problems that we saw as a nation on Election Day. We had long lines. We had elections having to take place in states that were ravaged by natural disasters, and there not being adequate emergency planning occur. And as a result, we are having a national conversation about the importance of voting and the importance of election administration. The president mentioned the importance of voting in no fewer than 3 national addresses. He's creating a bipartisan commission on election administration reform, and we're seeing legislatures take meaningful steps to make it freer and fairer for people to participate.
And some unexpected people have entered that conversation, Myrna. As someone who monitors this and watches this so closely, enlighten us as to the significance of Governor Bob McDonnell of Virginia's announcement yesterday.
That's a very exciting development. Virginia is was one of 4 states that had a very restrictive policy regarding when people with criminal convictions in their past could participate in elections. Virginia was one of 4 states by which it didn't matter what you did, how long ago it was, how young you were at the time. If you had a felony conviction, you were not able to get your right to vote back forever unless the governor specifically pardoned you. And yesterday he announced a plan whereby he would restore voting rights to certain people with criminal convictions in their past if they met certain eligibility requirements. What I do think is important to remember is prior to this change, we do have 4 million people living and working in the community who cannot vote because of a criminal conviction, and it is going to be disruptive to a successful reentry. And it's it's hard to have a robust democracy when we have certain people that can't participate in it.
Yeah.
So the fact that Virginia is moving more toward the mainstream is, again, a welcome development, and we hope that they will continue to press forward in this and at some point become the kind of state that lets people register to vote upon being released from prison.
You know, he's been under a lot of fire recently, has Attorney General Eric Holder. And, you know, if he leaves the administration either because he chooses to or because the administration chooses to have him leave, how does that affect voting rights? I mean, he's someone who really, whatever you think of Eric Holder on a lot of issues, he really has been strong on voting rights and representing the people. How would that change things?
I think there's a very strong groundswell among the public in support of their right to vote. We saw a pushback when there were state legislators trying to manipulate the rules of the game to keep people not voting. And the Department of Justice was a welcome and very, very important ally in this. But we have really robust and important voting rights protections, federal protections, and any Department of Justice should take seriously their obligation to enforce those. And the voters and the voting advocates and voting rights lawyers will make sure that they do.
Yeah, well, you know, there was a lot of fear that after the election, this issue would be forgotten. That's why there are people like Myrna Pérez, Deputy Director of the Brennan Center for Justice, who continue fighting even when it's an off year. Thank you so much, Myrna, for coming on the show. Coming up, when he opens at the Tijuana Comedy Store, they introduce him as El Gato Gracioso. Here we call him Brett. He's next. Stick around.